You know, there's many ways to do it, some which are much better than others, but one of the biggest challenges when it comes to raw photo editing has to do with correcting exposure. If you simply use the exposure slider, you could be left with flat light or maybe muddy contrast and dull colors. And in this video, I'll show you a great technique that'll correct this mistake while preserving incredible contrast, while preserving dynamic light and beautiful colors, all while never even touching the often overdone exposure slider. This is an image from my recent Indonesian workshop I just returned home from. This is from the island of Bali. And of course, this image on the left-hand side here, this is the final edited version. And this image on the right side is the raw file, which is grossly underexposed. And I figured this would be a fantastic example to demonstrate this technique. And I'm gonna edit this, do a real quick edit on the raw file, just to show you the difference between only using just kind of basic adjustments, mainly the exposure slider. And I'll also do another version using a much, much better technique in my opinion. And I wanna compare the two just so you can really see the difference here. So this image here, let's just go to the gallery and click on this photo right here. Let's come up to develop. And if I wanted to, if I'm just looking at the histogram up here, I obviously wanna push this histogram more to the right. That will mean that it's basically becoming brighter. It's very underexposed, so that histogram is pushed more towards the left right now. So if I only use the exposure slider, and I just kind of pull this up here until the histogram is starting to look more filled out. If I take the shadows and bring them all the way up to plus 100 and bring the highlights down to minus 100, that was kind of my go-to scenario when I first got started with photography. And I did this technique for years, especially when I would get a very explosive and vibrant sunrise or sunset. I always wanted to preserve all of the detail in that sky. So I often found myself really underexposing those types of photographs. So when I would go to edit those photographs, this was the type of kind of editing recipe I'd have to go through. And I want to show you the problem with this. So as you can see this right now, it definitely looks more well exposed than it did before. This is where we started. This is where we're at right now. A huge difference, right? It looks much better, but there's a lot of problems with this. So as I mentioned, histogram looks good, but now the light is very flat. The contrast isn't super good and the colors are all washed out. Now, I'm gonna edit this photo using this technique. I'm gonna show you the difference. So let me come back here to library, I have another copy of this raw file right here. And I'm gonna come up to the develop module. Now, one of the limitations within Lightroom is that there's not really any way to edit exposure just for the midtones. So there's no midtone slider inside of Lightroom, which is definitely a drawback in my opinion. Midtones are a very powerful aspect of your photograph, very powerful aspect of the histogram, but there is a workaround and it's this right here. So if I come over here to color grading and I select midtones, if you have this area here selected, just come up here and just select this button here and that will identify the midtones. And you can see that you have these sliders for the midtones. You have hue, you have saturation, and then you have luminance right here. And if you're not familiar with what luminance is, it's basically the brightness value of a color. It could be the brightness value of a tone. And in this particular scenario, this is the brightness value of the midtone. So this is in essence a midtone slider to enhance exposure only for the midtones. And that's very powerful. This is a fantastic workaround that I use on just about every single one of my photographs. So the very first thing I would do in this type of a scenario is come over here to midtones and take this luminance slider and bring it all the way up to 100. And if you pay attention to the midtones right here, as I rock this back and forth, you can see that it is only impacting the midtones, which is absolutely fantastic. So I'm gonna take this all the way up to plus 100. Now I'm gonna come back to the basics section. And when photographs of mine are grossly underexposed, like this one right here, I like to start with the darkest aspects of the photograph. So I'm gonna start with the black point. I'm gonna start with the shadows. So I'm gonna come over here to the blacks and I'm gonna bring it up quite a bit. I'm gonna come over here to the shadows. I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna bring that up quite a bit. And now let's toggle this on and off. So this is where we started and this is where we're at right now. This is before. And this is after. So a huge difference. And obviously we haven't even touched the exposure slider. All we've done is bring up the exposure in the midtones, bring up the black point and bring up the shadows. And once I do that, now I'm gonna come over here to the white point. I'm gonna bring that up quite a bit as well to a value of about right here. Maybe even bring the highlights down just a small amount. And as you can see, the histogram looks much better. Before it was so underexposed, it was all pushed to the left. Now it's starting to kind of fill out the entire histogram, which is fantastic. And we have not even touched the exposure slider. So what I would do at this point, I think I'm gonna bring up that white point just a little bit further. Now I'm gonna come up here to the mask section. I'm gonna put a linear gradient on the sky. I'm gonna hold down the shift key and just kind of drag this down to a point right here. I'm gonna bring the exposure down a little bit to maybe about there. Let's bring the highlights down a fair amount to about right there. Let's add a little bit of contrast to the sky. And I think what I want to do is this overall photograph has got purples and magentas and blues and oranges, and that's a lot of different colors. And I want to kind of simplify that color palette a little bit. So what I'm going to do is kind of neutralize the sky a little bit. I'm going to come over here to point color. I'm going to select this eyedropper. I'm going to drop it on an orange color here. I'm going to take this hue channel, I'm just going to bring it over to the left just a little bit because I just want to kind of shift those oranges a little bit more towards red. Let's kind of decrease the saturation of that as well. Maybe find one more version of this yellow, maybe about right there. And let's do the same thing, shift it a little bit more towards red, reduce the saturation a little bit. And it might not look like we did a whole lot, but if I toggle that mask on and off, you can see what that has done. So now that kind of orange in the sky isn't quite so orange anymore. It's starting to kind of have a little bit more of a simplified color palette. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close that down. I actually want to change the color temperature of this photograph a little bit. Let's cool it down a little bit, and let's kind of just add a little bit of magenta to this photograph to about right there. I think that looks good. Now kind of my standard go-to, I always reduce the clarity, always bump the texture, and always bring down a little bit of negative dehaze just to kind of soften the overall photograph a little bit. Now what I want to do is I want to get away from that flat light scenario, which was the way we edited this photograph to begin with, the first version, where we bumped the exposure slider and we cranked up the shadows, and it really just made everything very washed out and kind of dull. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to the mask section, and I'm going to select a new mask. Let's do another linear gradient. This time we're going to drag it from the bottom up, and I want to darken this area a little bit. So we darken the sky, we're going to darken the bottom portion. I'm going to increase the black point just so the black tones aren't too dark, maybe to about right there. Kind of decrease this just a little bit. Let's toggle both of these masks on and off. So as you can see, we darken this area up here, we darken the bottom area here, but the area of interest is right here across the center. And that's a very powerful, or I should say very important aspect of this, is because when you increase the exposure channel, your basic, or I should say the exposure slider, you're increasing the exposure across the entire photograph. But a lot of times your photograph might have a certain area of interest. In this image here, it's the boat. That's the area that I'm most interested in. And that is the area of the photograph that I want to enhance the exposure just a little bit. Or I shouldn't say enhance the exposure, but just draw attention to that area with light. But I still want to have a complex or a more dynamic lighting scenario of this photograph. And this is a great way to do that by using these masks. So now I'm going to come up here, I'm going to hit the plus sign. Let's do object selection, and we're going to use a technique from my video last week actually. Let's select this boat, and let's come over here, open this up a little bit. Let's hit subtract by color range, and let's just select these colors we want to eliminate here from my mask, just to keep this mask a little bit more targeted, actually quite a bit more targeted. I think that looks good. I guess you can see how refined that mask is now. And we're not gonna bring up the exposure, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring up the shadows a little bit. Let's bring up the whites. Look at how much brighter just using the white channel can provide your photograph, I should say. So bring that up a little bit. Same thing with the highlights as well. I think a lot of times I used to always overlook the power of highlights and overlook the power of the white point when it comes to increasing the brightness value of a certain area of a scene. But a lot of times just small changes to the white point, small changes to the highlights slider can really enhance the overall brightness level of a certain area of your scene. And that's really all that I'm going to do to this area here. I may bring a little bit of contrast, bump the highlights a little bit, bump the white point, and a small boost to the shadow section. And as I toggle this on and off, you can see what that has done. Let me just bring this white point up just a little bit more just so you can more easily see this at home to about right here. Toggle this on and off. I can see a little area where that mask missed right there, but that's okay. It's not going to be, it's not going to impact the overall exposure of this photograph or the overall purpose of this video, I should say. So I'm going to close that down right there, And I think that that is really starting to come together. Now I'm going to come over here to the tone curve. I like to do this as well, just to kind of lift the shadow point, or I should say the black point right here. Let's introduce just a subtle S curve, a little bit of contrast. We toggle this on and off as well. You can see what that has done. Then I'm going to come over here to the effects section. I'm going to add a very subtle vignette to this photograph. And as I toggle this on and off, this is where we started, and this is where we're at right now. This is before, and this is after. And you can see what a massive difference this photo looks like now. And we never even touch the exposure slider at all. Maybe even add a little bit of contrast to this photograph. Never even touch that. Maybe bring down the saturation just a touch of the overall scene to about maybe right there. But I think that's a very, very powerful technique. Now let's compare the two images. So let me come back here to the library, come over here, and let's compare these two. And as you can see, this is the image on the right that had the exposure bump, bringing up the shadows and cranking down the highlights, which is the way I always used to edit an underexposed photograph. But by using a more refined touch, the image on the left side definitely has better colors, better contrast, much more dynamic lighting scenario. It doesn't look flat and dull anymore like this photograph does here. The colors are much better, the light's much better, contrast is better. This image on the left is substantially better, in my opinion, than this one right here, where all we did was just use the exposure slider. And once again, I just want to reiterate this photograph on the right that we just edited has nothing done to the exposure slider whatsoever. So the next time you have one of those grossly underexposed photographs, please think, definitely think about using a more kind of polished technique instead of just jumping right in there to the exposure slider. Give a nice boost to the midtones, the brightness level of the midtones by using that color grading section. And then go into each individual slider, the black point, the shadows, the white point, and the highlights to kind of create a more refined way to increase the overall exposure of your photograph. I think you'll be really pleasantly surprised by how much of a difference it makes in the end result. If you have any questions about this quick technique, please leave those in the comment section below and I'll get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. And if you do have, I just said that, I just got back from the trip to Bali literally last night. So I am operating on a ton of jet lag, very little sleep. I wanted to make sure I got this video out to you because it was something that I was working on with some of the participants during the workshop. And this is a fantastic image to demonstrate it on. But if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you checking out this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.